Hey everybody, it's David Becker, and welcome to another installment of the series in honor of Joe Diorio. It is the 20th anniversary of the release of The Color of Sound, and I have today with me an old friend. I'm really great that he made the time to do this, Pino Marrone. Hey Pino, thanks for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure, Dave. This is great. Just reconnecting with you after knowing each other for so long, and to talk about Joe, what could be better?
Well, I appreciate you doing this, man. Let's talk a little bit about how we met, because I had gone to GIT in 1980, and you came, when did you come?
Well, my story is a little bit different because I moved from Argentina to LA in the late 70s, in 78 actually. You know, and by that time by the time I met Joe, which was much later in 84, I had been a professional musician for 8 years. And I never went to GIT as a student.
Right.
So I was Joe's private student.
Okay.
And what happened was as I started getting into jazz, deeper into jazz, because I had been playing and recording before, but deeper into it, and looking for the right person to help me with, I was fascinated listening to Nefertiti and all that music coming out of Miles and Coltrane, just like the modal freer stuff, and all the fingers were signaling Joe, he's the guy. Okay. And I was very good friends with John Pisano, the great late friend of mine. And John said, look, I'll give you Joe's number. Just give him a call. Okay. I'm sure he'd be up for some lessons. And I called Joe, and he said, look, yes, we had a very nice chat, actually. And he said, yes, I'd be willing to give you private lessons, but, like I live very far from here. Right. Knowing Joe, he always lives like 2 hours from...
Yes, Capistrano at the time.
Yeah. And so he said, I can give you lessons at GIT, at my office, after 6. Which is the time when I finished my work. This was back in the day when GIT was on Hollywood Boulevard.
Right, yes.
In the old building.
The old building, yeah. That's where we met.
Exactly. So, to make a long story short, one thing led to another. We really became very friendly, and he was incredibly generous to me. And one day he said, look, I want to help you out. I believe in what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And forget about the money. I'm here a couple of times a week. Mm-hmm. I'll just put your name at the door and just come here anytime. Okay. And we can hang and play, and I'll help you out, with whatever you need.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's like, for me, that right there is, it's like...
Yes. Yeah. That's Joe Diorio. That's how Joe was. He was that, what's interesting, I mean, people that are not familiar with you, I just have to say that you were a very famous guitar player in Argentina before you came to LA at a young age. And a lot of people still know your work. And the fact that you kind of were anonymous in the States, in LA, you were able to connect with one of the greatest guitar players in the world, who actually was very instrumental in helping you to achieve what you wanted to achieve out of that, which is really great, because Joe was somebody who would open the door to anybody, and he had that sense of being able to understand how people learned, and not one size fits all. Some guys will go like, well, here's this scale, and do this and learn that arpeggio, and he wasn't like that. No. But I want to talk about when we met, because you were coming to the school every day, or pretty much 3 days a week, I think, or something.
No, I'd go there maybe once a week.
Because every time I would come, you would be there. I would come.
Yeah. Well, Joe was there. I think he was there on Mondays and on Tuesdays.
Yeah.
And I made it every time I could for a few years, for maybe between 84 and 86.
So that was the time that I had put the band together to tour. We did our first tour in '84. We did an EP with Warner Brothers, did a Germany tour and a United States tour, and I think I met you right around that time. And then,
well, I remember that day because you came in with a bass player.
That's right. Yes, with Jim Donica. Yep.
And he had his upright bass with him.
Upright with him, yeah. And we all
so you came in and we all jammed together a little bit, and then you played some of your tunes with him.
That's right. Yeah. And I remembered a story this morning about when you and I and Joe were in his room. This was without Jim, but there was another guitar player, I think from Brazil, and we were playing Body and Soul, which I knew the tune, but I didn't know it that well. And so I think Joe called it or something, and Joe played an incredible solo, and then you played, and Joe looked at me and he said, "David, you take one." And I was like, I don't really know the tune in my head, but I started to play. And at the end of the tune, I looked at Joe and I said, "You know, that's the first time I've ever played that tune." And Joe said to me, "Wow, man, you sound like you've been playing it your whole life." And that was one of the best compliments I ever got from Joe.
Of course. Joe's energy, I found Joe's energy very liberating.
Yes.
Conducive for things like this to happen.
You know, we did spend a lot of time together because I made sure that I would hang, and I remember that because you were showing up regularly, I always looked forward to coming because we had a friendship that we were building.
Yeah.
And it was important to me to be able to maintain that as long as you were there. So I always made sure I'd come in and I'd say, "Is Pino there?" And you'd always be there. So we would hang and play and talk.
That's fantastic. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. I'm glad to know that. Yeah, well, those were fantastic days. For me, very, very special getting to know someone like Joe. And also my first encounter with a totally different way of approaching teaching, which was like equal parts laboratory and just creative lab. You know, he would invent things in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Of course, that was the
just incredible things, and you know. I think in the beginning, you know, at least I would think, oh my God, you know, this is so bold, you know, such a bold idea, that this is so interesting, you know. And 2 minutes later, we were all kind of like playing it on a blues or something, and it became just it became one more idea, you know. And looking back, it wasn't one more idea. I mean, like, you don't hear to this day, you know, you don't hear many people who could come up with such original, unique vocabulary, and not only the vocabulary, but just the way he played.
He was, I mean, I've talked about this with Tim Lurch the other day, is that to me, Joe Diorio in the early 70s was far beyond any other guitar player of his generation, and still to this day, he did things that not anybody has even come close to.
No, and the problem was that he wasn't very well documented. No. I think, because, you know, I had known about Joe through the Ira Sullivan album, you know, on Horizon, you know, which was probably the best distributed album that he was on. And I could tell already that something incredible was happening, you know. But then I kind of lost track of him. Yeah. And sometimes I share it with other friends and students. You know how we all have our favorite records and we all have our favorite gigs that we remember? Yeah. I said, look, if I told you that some of my favorite music was like Joe Diorio in his room, that's one, and Joe Diorio playing in a duo setting with Potter Smith. And that's some of the most incredible jazz music I ever heard in my life. And
I have to second that. I have tapes of Joe Diorio trio he used to play when I was a student in 1980. I was 18, and I would go to these clubs like Dante's and Carmelo's and the Maiden Voyage, and he would play with Bob Mays, who was Bob Magnuson's brother-in-law, and either Sherman Ferguson or Carl Burnett. And they would play 3 sets, and I would go to my little tape recorder, and I'd sit in the corner, and I'd be there, and I'd help Sherman load his drums out, and help Joe with his thing. It was the most incredible stuff I've ever heard. And then a year later, in '81 or '82, he played a concert with Tal Farlow. So it was Joe with Luther Hughes, and I don't remember the drummer. I think it might have been Jim Plank. And they played as a trio. This was at McCabe's. And then Tal came, because he came out of retirement. He did a set, and they did a set together. And it was just amazing. I mean, the stuff I saw. And then I took a friend of mine to the Come Back In, because Joe was Come Back In. I Come Back In regularly in '84 for a year. Yeah. And I took this keyboard player who was a huge Joe Zawinul fan to see Joe Diorio. And Joe, Joe could be up, he could have great nights, and he'd have nights that were not so. They're still great, but that pinnacle, when he would reach that high, that was a night. And she was just on the floor. Her mouth was wide open, and she said, "He's like Joe Zawinul on the guitar." She said, "I can't believe it's incredible." And I just those moments still reverberate in my mind, and I hear them still to this day.
Yeah, exactly. You just mentioned the Come Back In. And I think I saw him playing with Potter there. And, to me, Joe, people say, we were just saying, how incredible he was as an improviser and a guitarist. But to me, he goes way beyond the guitar. I mean, like, if his ideas had been played by a flutist, he'd be the most interesting flutist you ever heard, or something like that. And not that many people know about this because of his lack of exposure for 1,000 reasons, but some of us know it, like Sid Jacobs, people who had been very close to Joe and just witnessed it firsthand for a long time.
Yeah, well, I mean, he had, the ability to reach so many people through his teaching, and later on they discovered his recordings. And I was so grateful that we got to do The Color of Sound, because that's the last thing Joe recorded before his stroke. And I really wanted to do this album since I knew Joe Diorio, and I had lost the hope to do it, but we did a tour together in 1999 of Europe. So we were in the UK, we were in Germany, in Switzerland, in Austria, and we did this 3-week tour. And it got me thinking about, gee, I should try to do this album with Joe, because I had him scheduled to do my second album as a guest appearance, which I had to sadly cancel because we ran over budget. And Joe was very understanding, but then my record company said to me, do you want to do a record with anybody? And I said, yeah, Joe Diorio. And they said, yeah, we'll pay for that. And so I called Joe. I said, man, I got money to do an album, and let's, we took 2 days, and it was important for me to get Joe's sound recorded the best it could be, and also the environment to not just be 2 guys playing tunes, but to give an atmosphere of what I felt would represent what we could do. And we got a lot of really interesting stuff on that record, and I'm very proud of it. And Joe loved it too. So
it's I can testify that, because Joe gave me a copy, and he said, look, Pino, listen to this, pay attention to it whenever you have some time. I think it's a really good record. And he gave it to me. I used to visit him almost every year during the last part of his life, to Waterbury, Connecticut, because I spent time in New York, a little time in New York almost every year, and I would just take the train and go visit him, and maybe stay a couple of nights in a hotel in town, and just hang out and talk. And for the people who don't know him, he's the kind of person that, even not able to play the guitar, as he had, he was dealing with this, with his recovery from a
Right.
stroke,
Yeah.
it was like playing, in a
Oh, of
way.
course.
It felt like playing.
Well, I'll tell you a story. When he had the stroke, I just landed in Argentina, and I heard through Daniel Corso from
Yeah.
Sid that he had the stroke. So I called to talk to Tina, and Joe picked up the phone, and I said, Joe. He said, yeah, David, I had the stroke, but I'm going to recover and this and that. So I went to visit him right after that tour with Richard Smith. We went down to see him, and at that point he was still in a wheelchair. But maybe 6 months later, I went alone, and I brought my guitar, and I know that Tina told me that the therapist said you need to put the guitar in your hand. It's good therapy. You know, hold it, just hold it. So I said to Joe, Joe, let's play. He said, no, David, you play. And I said, come on, Joe, let's play. And he picked up his 175. His hand could barely move, but everything that came out of it, it was Joe Diorio. I mean, the sound was amazing. The phrasing was still there because the music's inside. And this is just the vehicle in which he used, but whatever his limitations were, he still was able to communicate that. And I know to his death, he was still working on music because you saw him a lot. I went to visit him several times. I talked to him on the phone every day during the pandemic, and I recorded a lot of our conversations. And I know that he loved my Etudes book, and we would talk about lots of stuff for hours and hours. And he was still working on music, which is just amazing.
Yeah. He was still working on music, and he had the same spirit. You know, it was remarkable.
Yes,
it was remarkable.
It was, yeah.
And also just a lesson, another lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, it's Joe was also somebody that was just a very spiritual guy who was very deep, and he also had this sense of history, and he talked a lot about things in his later years that, his experience with Wes Montgomery and just different things that I didn't know that was great to hear directly from him that were lessons of life, because even though his career never took that straight path to go to wherever people wanted to go, he still was able to manifest something. I remember Pat Metheny and I talked about it in the early 2000s, and he said, Joe Diorio is much more famous now than he was when I met him in 1973 in Miami. And it's true to this day that you go to all over the world. I've got a student from Vietnam. He's a huge Joe Diorio fan. And there's generations of kids everywhere who know the name Joe Diorio. They know his books. They know his recordings. So it's
absolutely, because there was already a big leap going from Miami to LA.
Yeah.
And of course, being at GIT, he met a lot of people. This was way before the internet or anything, but word goes fast, when among guitar players who are looking for the same thing. So it only exploded with internet. But still, I know that Joe had a side that very few people saw, which was when he was in the zone.
Oh, yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah. Well, to experience that as a listener, and also experience that as a player, was interesting for me, because when we were doing the album, we got into that zone on a lot of things. And I remember vividly, we didn't talk much. We just faced each other in the studio, but I remember hearing in my head this conversation that we were having musically, and just going, I'm listening to Joe Diorio play some incredible stuff, but I'm actually contributing to this, which was just beyond what I had imagined as just a listener. And it was very cool to be able to do that, because it reminded me of all the times I saw him do that zone, what we were talking about. And to be able to be a part of that, for me, was an honor in a huge way,
Well, imagine what it was like for me when he finally one day invited me to play a duo concert with him.
Yeah.
In Hollywood, and
At the school, yeah.
At the school, yeah. And I didn't know what to think about this. Of course, I was happy, but it was like, really?
Yeah.
So I said, so what are we going to play, Joe? And he said, we're going to do the same thing we do when we get together, except we're going to do it on stage.
Exactly. It's documented. That's the thing. When he was at USC, we talked about Pat Metheny earlier, and Pat and Joe go way, way back. And I know that every time Pat would come to LA, he would make sure that Joe was at the school if he was going to visit, because he wanted to play with Joe, because he loved that. And so they hadn't played together in a long time. And I was in Germany, and I met with Pat, and I was doing a little bit of guest teaching at USC. And I said, hey, Pat, I said, next time you're in LA, man, can you come to USC to play with Joe? He said, I'd love to. I haven't played with Joe in a long time. And I know they were talking about trying to do a record together, but I just remember I brought Pat to the school. So we drove together, got there, and they were sitting here playing, and the kids were over here. And at the end of the session when they played, Pat looked at me and he said, thanks, man. And then when I got Pat off in his car and he split, then Joe came to me and he said, thanks, man. And that meant so much to me that I was able to bring these two guys together for this impromptu couple hours, and that's the last time. That's not the last time. They played together one more time after that, but that was one of the last times they played together.
Probably. I was present during one of their. I think it was in '89. They played. Yeah, and the place was packed. It was like 10 in the morning or something like that, and we were all like floating, not believing what we. That day, I have a great memory of that day, because when they finished playing, when we went out for a sandwich with Joe, as everybody did, and then we went back to the room with a cup of coffee, and he was very inspired by what happened and started playing solo guitar non-stop for over an hour. And if I'm not mistaken, there was, I don't know, Don Mock had something to do with him playing a synth guitar that day in that room. So he played with an orchestra sound.
I remember that. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. Because I think he had it set up for a while around that time, and it sounded like Charles Ives or something like that. Just because his ideas, again, being so bold, no matter on which instrument, sounded like an just classical. Modern contemporary music,
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that I wanted to do on the album we did, is I wanted to use some orchestrations, because, in fact, the very last piece of music on there is called In a Minute. And it's a very, very subdued piece where I believe I'm playing a 9-string acoustic, and Joe's playing his 175.
Wow.
And we had done a piece that's on the album, which is called Reflections of India, which is very, this Indian rock kind of thing.
Yeah, with kind of an open tuning thing, right? Yeah.
And so after we did that, Joe said, hey, David, let's do something really, really like quiet like that. And so we did that. And when I was listening back to that take, I could hear these harmonic strings moving in and out. They weren't there, but they were there. So I overdubbed with a synthesizer and put them in there, and it's beautifully placed. And Joe plays so beautifully, man. You have to really listen carefully, but there's some stuff that he does where it's like, wow. It has the intensity, but yet it's so subdued.
That you remind me, I'm going to listen to that piece again.
Please do.
That takes me to another thing that isn't talked about enough, I don't think, which is the soft and romantic side of Joe. Because people usually will associate him with, his, quartal, 12-tone lines.
Right.
And all that incredible stuff that he used to play, but he was also a very delicate player.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he played. I was talking to Kathy Siegel Garcia yesterday, and they did a record together in the '90s, and everything became a ballad. And I told her, I said, one of my favorite records of Joe's is with Ira Sullivan, The Breeze and I. Do you know that one?
Me too. That's one of my favorite records. Yeah.
And Joe only comps. It's just Ira on flute and Joe comping, but it's so beautiful.
And then he plays some solos, overdubbing, you know, but that record probably showcases what I was talking about more than most.
Yeah.
And it's not what I was expecting, because I was expecting those two together. Oh, come on, you know. Yeah. But it was so sweet. Even Ira's playing, you know,
It's beautiful.
it's a very special meeting.
Yes.
At a very particular time when they just decided to just play a certain repertoire too, you know, certain very romantic tunes, if I may say.
Oh, sure.
I don't know if that's the word.
No, that is. I mean, in fact, the title track of The Color of Sound is a piece that I wrote for Joe. And I remember when I came up with the melody for it, I could hear Joe's phrasing. And there's one phrase in the melody, I'll play it for you. It's when it goes to the A minor, and it's like... And just the way Joe played it on the recording is exactly how I imagined him playing it. I didn't have to, it was like tailor-made for Joe Diorio. Yeah. And then the solo that he plays on there, and I had some pads in the back and I'm doing comping, and he just played so beautifully. It was like, wow. And I think that was, for him, because we got frenetic and did all this improvised stuff too, he was able to use the juxtaposition of the things that he could do so well in a setting that allowed him to do that, because we took a long time to do it. We took 2 days, 2 full days, which was a lot, because he was used to doing things in 3 hours. Yeah. And it made the environment. And then of course we've got stuff like the first track, which we called Blues for Brother Brew. I wrote that for Joe, but that blues we probably did 12 takes of that. And the last take is the one that we used on the record. Because every time I'd go, let's do that blues again, or Joe said, hey David, let's play that blues again. And I probably have like 6 hours of music, but that was just so much fun. So.
Where did you guys record it?
We did it at a studio in North Hollywood. It's called Steakhouse Studios, which is a friend of mine that owns it. Steve Lukather does a lot of work there, and Jeff Beck worked there. A whole bunch of people have worked at that studio, but it was a really big room. There was a Jimi Hendrix mural to our left, so that was kind of inspiring. And we just set up and faced each other.
Do you remember what kind of amp did Joe use? Yeah,
he used an amp that I had, was made by a guy, Mike Holland. Holland amps were handmade amps, very much like Dumbles, and I had one. And so I had Joe use that. But what I did do, Pino, is I made sure that we went direct to.
Yeah,
that's how
just to
blend,
have...
Yeah, to blend the sounds to be able to get the best articulation for Joe's sound. And I think I played through a little Fender, but I also went direct. So a lot of what you hear of Joe's playing is some of the amp, but it's also the direct sound mixed in.
So it's a tube amp, right?
Yeah. Which, he wasn't really fond of tube amps because he didn't, Joe wasn't very technically savvy, but
no. I
told Kathy a funny story the other day about that gig with Tal Farlow, where he was in the middle of playing the first tune and his distortion was on from the polytone by accident. and Luther Hughes, I heard it, I was going to run up there and turn it off, and Luther Hughes went over and turned it off and said, your distortion was on. But in the studio, we were doing a track, I think we did Stella by Starlight, and we only did 1 take of that. And Richard Smith from USC was there with a guitar player from Italy. And I didn't know they were there. I'd invited them to the studio. So Joe and I are playing, and we did this 8-minute version of Stella, and we finished. And then I look over in the booth, and there's Richard and the guy, and they're jumping up and down, because they were so amazed by what we had just played. And so, had we known they were there, we probably would have played horribly. But we just tuned everybody out. So it was a really cool thing.
That's a great story.
I want to tell you a story that Joe told me that he very fondly thought of, was when you had him come to Argentina. I think the first time there was a workshop or a gig that you had put together, and you told Joe, just get a taxi and here's the address, and I'll meet you there. and it was probably like an hour. You know how the roads are in Argentina, even in Buenos Aires, you know, the taxis drive like crazy. But Joe got in the taxi, and he said he had the most amazing conversation with the driver. He spoke no Spanish, the guy spoke no English, but they communicated for the whole hour and a half. And he said he never forgot that guy, what they talked about in that time. So,
Oh, that's, yeah, yeah. Well, you know, that's what happens when people are willing to communicate, you know, and Joe was an open vessel for that. You know, I took Joe in Buenos Aires. I took him to one of the last tango joints in a faraway neighborhood where only the people from the area would go.
yeah.
And the players were all like about 80 years old.
Okay.
And somehow there was a mixture of the tango vibe, you know, and a certain Italian thing that happens in that neighborhood too, because there's a huge Italian population, not only in Argentina but particularly in that neighborhood. And Joe felt so at home. Like at home, you know, and he was digging the music, you know, the bandoneon players and everything. And you know, I just took a wild, you know, I figured, well, you know, this is at least going to be colorful for him, you know. Right. But he said, man, I don't think I'll ever forget those guys, you know. So you know, those stories, I don't know if they're interesting for anybody else, but for me, they're like, you know, they made up my who I am, you know.
Oh, of course. Well, that's a big part. I mean, I can remember fondly, you know, being on the road with him and many stories. In fact, when you talked about him talking with the story about the taxi driver, we were on the tube in London. And we were going to one of the schools, and there was a little girl over there, and Joe looked over and said, "Hi, how are you?" And, you know, he just started to talk to this little girl just out of the blue, and that's just how Joe was. It was just, he just had a really, really, really great sense of just of being, you know.
And also related to being in the moment, because I think he played kind of like that too, you know. He would just grab the guitar and just start playing with no preludes, nothing. There was an immediacy in his behavior as a musician that almost made the guitar itself disappear. It was just like part of him, you know. It was just like he would just get it and start playing, and you know, they were, as we all aspire to get there sometimes, to be just one, you know, with the music, with the instrument.
Yeah, Joe had that ability, and he told me once, he said, "Mark, we were on the road in Germany, and we were listening to a solo record of McCoy Tyner, which was recorded in Carnegie Hall, but no audience. And it's a beautiful record. He does a version of a John Coltrane tune and a lot of ballads. And Joe said, you know, that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to pick up the guitar, start with one note, and just flow for, and he could do that. But at that point, he still felt like he was working towards that, which just shows you that he was always a student of the art for his entire life, which we all are. You know?
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. It's, well, you know, he was talking about McCoy. He was the first guy. When I met Joe, I had transcribed McCoy, but I don't think I was able to do anything with what I transcribed, you know. Right. But when I started, you know, being around Joe, and he would show me some ideas, and I would see him play them, and he would say, you know, now you try, and everything. I started to understand McCoy and Herbie doing that kind of quartal vocabulary in a very clear way, because he played it with a lot of feeling, and you know, he would hum along many times, which added to the drama, you know. And just the whole expressiveness of it. You know, those you know, he'd be playing, you know, those kinds of ideas, you know.
Right.
And he'd play them like if he was playing a simple blues.
Oh yeah, sure.
With the same facility and expressiveness.
Oh, absolutely. When I heard him play the first time, that's what struck me, was the ability for him to play in a traditional setting, but take that angular move, which was so unique, and you could tell that it was Joe Diorio. It was so musical. It wasn't just calisthenics for the sake of what you could do. It had so much meaning, and you know, he was able to do that effortlessly, but also be able to play, like we talked about, the beautiful melodies and be able to make the notes sing in a way where, because some guys who are able to do that aren't able to do the other thing, and guys that can do the other thing can't do that. But Joe encompassed everything.
Yeah, yeah. He blended those hugely different feelings. He blended them seamlessly. And there was something so natural about the way he did it that he could go from one extreme to the other, or even mix them up in 4 bars sometimes, you know. And it's like, oh man, you know, it's like how unique can you get as an expressive artist, you know, beyond jazz, I mean, just, you know, just being a great artist at work.
Well, also he was able to reflect that in his paintings and his drawings too.
Very much so. I think so.
Yeah, he had, you know, that's the thing about Joe. I loved his self-portrait that he made, the one, you know, the angular guitar thing, which was just so Joe Diorio. I mean, it really was who he was. And I miss him. I think about him every day, and not a day goes by that I don't pick this instrument up, and I'll have moments where I hear Joe talking to me, and I'm sure maybe it's the same for you. You know,
exactly the same. There is no day where I pick up my instrument that when Joe is not here somewhere.
Yeah.
That's how strong a mark he left in me.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Pino. It's so great to see you, man, and reconnect. And,
absolutely. Thank you.
I hope to get back to Argentina. I haven't been there since 2018, but I do hope to get back down there soon, and we definitely have to connect. Or if you're in New York, let me know, and I'll fly out from Chicago or from St. Louis, and we'll hang.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you very much, David. I really enjoyed talking to you and remembering our great friend and mentor.